The Sociology of Freedom. Manifesto of the Democratic Civilization. Volume 3. Written by Abdullah Öcalan. A draft of the history of democratic civilization. The most basic feature of free human nature is that each person can choose their own history and know how to live by history. History is the interpretation of existence, the process that has been realized to date. The more diverse the forms of existence considered, the more histories we will have. But diverse histories do not mean that there is no historical unity. In the absence of unity, diversity is meaningless. Diversity exists only in connection with unity. The important issue is to determine what will represent this unity. In the case of the human species, intelligence and the ability to use tools provide a possible basis for unity. Without these abilities, there is no difference between them and other living species. There can, of course, be different bases for unity, including the state at times, and at other times democracy, the moral and political dimension of society, mentality, and the state of the economy. The important thing is to determine what sort of diversity can be developed on the basis of the unifying factor chosen. We consider moral and political society to be the fundamental basis of unity in a democratic civilization. To clarify what we mean, we have defined it and tried to determine its methodology. Now, I would like to draw a brief outline of its historical development. A. We know that close to 98% of social nature's life occurred in units of 25 to 30 people, what we call clan society. The clan can be defined as the stem cell of society. Clan society has carried on within all societies that have formed throughout time, including the family, the tribe, the ashiret, the peoples, and the nations, in a manner similar to cell differentiation. According to our basic definition of social nature, clan society is a moral and political society. Whether they use sign or symbolic language is not so important. Of course, the morality and politics that exist within a clan are very simple, but the important thing is that they exist. Just because it is at a simple level does not diminish its importance. On the contrary, it proves its importance. It may even be said that the strongest expression of morality is seen within clan society. It seems almost instinctual. Living according to morals is the sine qua non of existence. A clan that has lost its morality is a clan that has been dispersed, dismantled, or destroyed. That morality can be expressed in simple rules indicates its vitality. In comparison, today we can see the impact on society of the frequent violations of the rule of law is negligible. Given conservative nature of law, such violations may even play a more positive role. The deterioration of rules within the clan, however, means the end of the community. It is much the same for politics. A clan has two very simple jobs: hunting and gathering. Hunting and gathering are vitally important to all clan members. Surely they would have many times over discussed, consulted, shared experiments, and appointed members to form and implement the best and most efficient policies for hunting and gathering. Otherwise, life would not have been possible. The most fundamental political issue was what to gather and eat, and this was collective work. Politics is defined as collective work, which means that clan society was a very simple but vital political community. If a clan society ignored politics even for a day, it would have died. Politics are, as a result, of great structural importance. In most other ways, the human clan might have resembled other primates. The only significant difference between them was that the clan developed a simple moral and political social fabric. In this sense, even the development of tools come into play when there is a political dimension. Likewise, the development of language requires morality and politics. We should never forget that the discussion and decision-making to get any job done accelerated the need for the ability to speak. I find it pointless to argue that the nutritional needs of the clan gave rise to morality and politics. Surely an amoeba, a single-cell living entity, also has nutritional requirements, but we cannot speak of the morality and politics of amoebas. What makes a human being distinct from an amoeba is that morality and politics enter into the way humanity meets its nutritional requirements. In this sense, the Marxist statement, "economy determines all," doesn't explain much. The important thing is, in fact, how the economy is determined. For humans to resolve this, society requires a moral and political fabric and thus a social sphere. It is this feature that places clan society at the origin of the history of democratic civilization. In this respect, the history of democratic civilization is the history of 98% of humanity. In addition, as we mentioned, the clan continues to exist as the mother cell of the family, the tribe, the ashiret, the peoples, and national and international society, as well as of transnational communities. Around 20,000 years ago, as a result of glaciers melting in the Fourth Glacial Period, Mesolithic and Neolithic societies formed. Most spectacularly in the Taurus-Zagros ecosystem. These societies were substantially more advanced than clan society. They had advanced tools and settlement arrangements. Indeed, the first agrarian village revolution occurred during this period. While the Taurus-Zagros social system was predominant, similar formations started to appear wherever human communities lived at the time in Africa and Eurasia. I believe that this development was the result of the spread of Neolithic society of Taurus-Zagros region. This is a great epoch in the history of social nature. Many developments, such as the symbolic language that is still used, the agricultural revolution, the formation of villages, the origin of trade, the transition from a mother-based family to tribal and ashiret organizations, occurred during this historical stage. No doubt, the fact that this period was called the New Stone Age refers to the appearance of sophisticated stone tools. There was also a remarkable evolution of human intelligence. All tools and equipment that have left their mark to date, including principles of their usage, seem to have been invented back then. It is the second extended period of history. 1% of the remaining 2% reflected this period. Society was still essentially a moral and political society. There was still no law and no state. Power had not yet arisen. The mother was seen as sacred, and the goddess image was elevated. The transition to the period of sacred temples and mausoleums also occurred during this period. Life was lived in such direct contact with history that the living shared their space with their dead. The ruins of temples and mausoleums are a glaring example of this. We are faced with real and genuine people, not primitives. The second main period in the history of democratic civilization can be described as expressing the pure values of democratic civilization. As symbolic language and intelligence developed, moral and political society experienced democracy in the most spectacular manner in the villages and tribes. This may seem odd, but it is the truth. This was the period when morality and politics were the purest democracy. The gradually increasing surplus product, led to systematic oppression and exploitation by the hierarchical powers and later city-based civilization forces that existed above society. B. Civilization narratives, called written history, begin history with the command of the creator. The history we are talking about is that of the last 5,000 years. With my sociological analysis as a starting point, I can say that such historical narratives are ideologically bent upon sanctifying oppression and exploitation. What all scientific schools, including so-called political economy, do is develop an ideology based on surplus value of the society that has experienced a qualitative development in the productivity of its labor practices. Hiding the truth required an enormous ideological effort and a lot of force. Construction of the city, the class, and the state occurred at the same time as the major ideological constructs arose. The main function of these ideologies was to depict creation and formation in a different way, project it as the successful work of the priest, the strongman, or the ruler, wrapped in divine imagery. Democratic civilization must first sweep aside these ideological veils and barriers. Only then can we better understand not only the family, agrarian village society, and tribal ashiret structures, but also the class nature of the city-based state, the ongoing established hierarchical power, and the original colonization of women. Such a paradigm shift would greatly improve our understanding. There is no doubt that aside from the triad of the city, class, and state, there is also the democratic civilization that continues in a new phase, even though it has profound contradictions with this civilization. While contradiction arose between rural and urban areas, the tendency for the rural and urban areas to complement one another outweighed the tensions. Just as democratic civilization had its urban extensions, the cities also had their rural extensions. In particular, hierarchical structures that grew strong in rural society became the collaborators of the city-state rulers. Nonetheless, the contradictions and conflicts took place between these two social blocks, whose material interests differed. Intense ideological, military, and administrative conflicts between democratic civilization, representing the communal, moral, and political society's forces, and the civilization based on capital and state monopoly did occur. There was also warfare among city rulers, as they sought to increase their shares. The lamenting and melodies that can be found in Sumerian epics in relation to the city make the intensity and severity of these conflicts apparent. It is possible to deduce that to a large degree, the tribal and ashiret structures arose in response to the attacks of city-based civilization. The ethnic structures we began to see around 4000 to 3000 BCE must also have been a product of this period. We know that it was the Sumerians and Egyptians who named the varying ethnicities. The Sumerians called those to the north and the northeast the Aryans. Those to the west were called the Amorites, the Gutians, and the Kassites. The Egyptians called those who came from the desert of the Sinai Peninsula the Apiru. It is generally accepted that Hebrew is derived from Apiru or Habiru. The ramparts erected around the cities and towers provide the best evidence of the existence of an opposing society. The intensity of the clashes makes it clear that society did not easily accept class-based civilization. Archaeological records prove that numerous villages and even some centers of civilization were burned to the ground. Mesopotamia is full of multi-layered mounds that were settled in areas that were burned down numerous times. Mythology and literature from this period also reflect this. Homer's Iliad is a third-hand version that reflects the epic tradition with Mesopotamian origins. Hesiod created a similar version that transformed the pantheon of Sumerian gods into the Olympus pantheon. That wars were the wars of gods personified by kings is a factor in all of the epic traditions of that period. It is quite clear that kings were identified with gods. The titles of Nimrod and the pharaohs are striking examples of that identification. While economic plunder and the enslavement of village societies were the anticipated result of war, there were also similar expeditions against the tribes to loot and take captives. Civilizations also considered plundering one another and taking slaves a significant source of wealth. Material interest continues to be a basis for conflict and reconciliation to this day. Everything was based on a calculation of who is stronger. The unity of the celestial gods is clearly understood as the symbolic state of the largest kingdom on earth. That the Ottoman sultans called themselves Zelula proves this. It would be a major shortcoming to present narrow class contradictions as fundamental during this historical period. Evidence suggests that the slaves at the time were essentially obedient servants of both their masters and the temple. They essentially acted as extensions of their masters' bodies. It was the villagers and the tribal and Ashiret communities that resisted and refused to be enslaved. There was also frequent battles among the monopolies as each attempted to increase its own share. Around 1500 BCE, a struggle for hegemony began, with the Hittites and the Hurrians and Mitannis on the one side, and the Egyptian civilization on the other side. In the Middle East, the Central Civilization first formed around 1500 BCE, with significant evidence of competition and the ultimate rise to hegemony of the history's first magnificent cities from 1500 to 1200 BCE. This is considered a very vibrant and glorious period in history. Tribal, Ashiret, and village communities continued to develop. Trade became so important that for the first time, empires began to be built around it. Assyria and Phoenicia essentially gained power through their trade monopolies. Around 1500 BCE, when Chinese and Indian civilizations were taking their first steps, Europe, as other parts of Asia, Africa, and America, were beginning to enter the Neolithic Age. My greatest interest lies with two historical periods: 6000 to 4000 BCE and the rise of the Neolithic agrarian village society, and the city life of urban society from 1500 to 1200 BCE. The originality, creativity, and rate of development and the epic narratives of these periods are most interesting. I believe that the epic heroism and ideas about divinity primarily arose during these periods. In outline, my analysis of the temporal and spatial spread and development of civilization is as follows. 1. Agrarian village society began right after the magnificent hunter and gatherer society, around 15,000 to 12,000 BCE, in the area where the Tigris and the Euphrates are fed by the Taurus-Zagros mountain system that converges with the lowlands, where there is an abundance of plant and animal species and a climate that provided natural irrigation. This agrarian village society was in its infancy. Its transformation to sedentary life only occurred around 6000 BCE. From 6000 to 4000 BCE, agrarian society experienced its most creative period. From 5000 BCE on, it began to spread everywhere. There was little immigration. The spread primarily took the form of cultural export. The Ubaid culture, which began its ascent with irrigated farming in Lower Mesopotamia around 5000 to 4000 BCE, grew strong enough to start colonizing parts of northern Mesopotamia. Archaeological remains attest to this culture's colonial spread in Upper Mesopotamia around 4000 BCE. But at the same time, that region predominantly maintained its own culture. The Uruk period emerged between 4000 and 3000 BCE. It represents the birth of the city. The subject matter of the Epic of Gilgamesh is this magical development. A similar northward expansion occurred during the Uruk period. Both periods of colonial expansion were likely the result of growing efficiency in weaving, pottery making, and agricultural production. The period from 3000 to 2000 BCE is the period of the classic Ur dynasties. Its distinctive feature is an increase in the number of cities and the intense and continuous conflicts among them, each hoping to increase its share. We can also call these wars for parceling out domination among early monopolists. 2. The Neolithic Revolution, with its clear center in Mesopotamia, can be thought to have spread to China, India, all of Europe, and the north and east of Africa around 4000 BCE, settling in these areas between 4000 and 2000 BCE. The Neolithic societies with European and Caucasian roots grew stronger and reversed the flow after 2000 BCE. This wave of onslaughts of the first large tribes from the north, who were on the offensive, which stretched from Anatolia to India and reached the civilizational centers of Mesopotamia and Egypt, led to an important historical upheaval. In addition, around 4000 to 2000 BCE, both the Arab tribes with Semitic roots and the mountainous Aryan tribes also attacked these civilizational centers in waves. Both types of civilization were observed to have developed within these initial expansionist colonial and anti-colonial movements. While the upper tribal strata began the process of transformation into a state, many of the other tribe members were incorporated into the slave class. There is disassociation within the ranks of the tribe and the Ashiret. While on one hand, new city civilizations were springing up, on the other hand, tribal and Ashiret organizations was increasing, and solidarity among them was growing. 3. The period from 2000 to 1500 BCE marked the end of Sumerian and Egyptian classical periods, with relations with Babylonia, Assyria, Mitanni, the Hittites, and the New Kingdom in Egypt deteriorating and conflicts becoming more intense. The era of the central hegemonic civilization had begun. A particular period of globalization was occurring. The northern tribes were using civilization's technical knowledge and practices against the centers of civilization, and the mountainous and desert tribes of the Middle East were continuing their uninterrupted attacks. It is also important to note that iron replacing bronze led to many new developments in arms technology. This is also the period when mineral exploration and trade became of central importance for the first time, with trade rising to previously unseen levels. The breathtaking rise of Assyria and Phoenicia was the product of commercial monopolies. In this context, there was a huge increase in construction of castles and ramparts. In the end, however, between 1500 and 1200 BCE, civilization was dealt a major blow by the attacks of the Scythians and the Dorians from the north, and Aramaic warrior tribes from the south, resulting in a period of decline from 1200 to 800 BCE, with the Assyrian Empire the only power to survive. 4. It is as if Greco-Roman civilization, the last great civilization of the classical era of antiquity, absorbed the legacy of the two previous civilization systems, Mesopotamia and Egypt. This civilizational process, lasting from 1000 BCE to 500 CE, continued to expand across Asia, Africa, and Europe, giving rise to an additional classical era, thereby effectively contributing to the civilization. As the mythological era faded in importance, a new and original religious, philosophical, and even scientific development began. The Roman Empire constituted the summit of capital and power monopolies. However, in good time, under the blows of democratic civilization forces, brought the empire, and with it antiquity, to a close. C. The Abrahamic religious tradition is the most difficult to place in the historical civilizational process. The nature of the civilization these three major religions belong to remains a controversial issue. After much thought, and on the basis of my analysis of civilization, I define the Abrahamic traditions as eclectic and typically conciliatory movements that try to find a middle way between the two main forces of civilization. Although I symbolically call them movements under the leadership of the Hebrew tribe, instead of addressing the racial basis of these religions, it would be more accurate to evaluate them as movements with a powerful ideological underpinning. Although the Abrahamic tradition is presented as tribal, it is essentially a centrist movement between the democratic civilization of Middle Eastern origin and statist civilizations. It is not exactly a class or a tribal movement. Furthermore, it is neither completely ideological nor completely moral and political. It is centrist in all respects. The tradition in question has maintained this quality since the prophet Abraham's appearance around 1700 BCE. This tradition has been a constant source of inspiration for both democratic and statist civilizations, while at the same time it has severed the ties of its affiliated forces from the legacy of these civilizations, with the consequence that attracting both their friendship and animosity resulted in historical developments. The Abrahamic religions ended the mythological era of the civilization and took leadership of the religious era. They may be more easily understood in the light of our new civilization paradigm. The most prominent narrative of the mythological era is that of the god kings. It should not be forgotten that storytelling in antiquity was loaded with mythology. It is futile to look for present-day rationality in this manner of storytelling. All facts are delivered and all events described using mythological language. The mythology of the Sumerian era was deeply influenced by animism. This era initially transformed this belief system, in some small ways, for the first time making a distinction between a divine and a non-divine nature. The essence of all Sumerian priests' inventions came from Upper Mesopotamian Neolithic society, and, instead of a mother goddess narrative, they favored a father and male god mythology. The great material transformation of society took place thusly. First came the male-dominated hierarchical order, followed by, and in parallel with, the birth of authority in the form of the state. We can find its reflection in the new religious mythology from the outset with the emergence of Enki, the crafty god. The struggle between the Uruk goddess Inanna and the Eridu god Enki around this issue is quite striking. Inanna tried to prove that all divine rights belonged to the mother goddess and claimed that out of the famous 104 mess, 99, things like virtue, talent, invention, and the arts, were created by women. Enki tells Inanna that her claims are no longer important and tells her to submit and listen to her father. Here, while declaring himself the father, man, and God, he reduces goddess Inanna to the position of his daughter and wife. Oh, how this resembles all of present-day secular, religious, and scientific preaching. I personally believe that Enki is the initial god of all of them. Enki is the original. All the others are adaptations and copies. The gods of Olympus in particular are the third or fourth versions of Sumerian mythology. The mythological narrative finally dies out with the onset of the Roman gods. According to the story, Abraham, who smashed the idols of gods in the pantheon of Urfa, was thrown into the fire by Nimrod. But a divine miracle occurred, where the fire burned and a sacred lake was formed. Abraham then migrated to the Canaan provinces because it became difficult for him to find shelter in areas controlled by Nimrod. In fact, it was a typical case of asylum. It was probably while he was the leader of a local tribe that he came into a conflict with Nimrod, the ruler of the city. It is clear that the dispute was about property, merchandise, and trade. At the time, there was both rivalry between the Babylonian and Egyptian civilizations, and the first period of very lively commercial trade had begun. This rivalry seriously impacted the traditional interest of thousands of people like Abraham. This was the material basis for Hejira and asylum. The lands of Canaan lay between two civilizations and were to some degree semi-independent. Abraham migrated when hegemonic powers began to target him. It is quite likely that this Hejira incorporates the stories of thousands of migrations into a single narrative, in the language of the time. All indications point to the fact that story in question tells of the contradictions and conflicts experienced by the local tribe and principalities, whose interests were submerged during this period under the weight of the two great civilizations. Not only did these forces reject the Nimrods and the pharaohs presenting themselves as gods, they also actively protested whenever they got the chance by smashing the representative idols. In short, the conflict over material interest was reflected as an ideological struggle. It was not easy to struggle against a god-king ideology that was at least 3,000 years old. It required enormous courage and ability. This is why Abraham's act of resistance in Urfa has taken on such miraculous significance, and why it was so important. Servants, for the first time, opposed God, and that was an unprecedented and miraculous development. There is both the material aspect, smashing the idols, and the new ideological quest, how and where to find the new God, and in a sense, how to create his own ideological construct, was still an open question, a question that was discussed for centuries thereafter. Abraham claimed he found his God by calling out to the voice that had inspired him, Wah-Hewe, or He is, Yahweh. Jehovah is the name of Abraham's first God. It seems very likely that the word has Aryan cultural roots. The transition to the theism of El, Ula, and Allah occurred long after Abraham went to the Canaan provinces. El has Semitic roots and reflected the features and the longing for similarity and unity of tribes living in the extensive desert environment. The second inspiration found its expression in Moses and his 10 Commandments. In fact, meeting God on Mount Sinai represents Moses' search for a solution to the worsening problems of the tribe he leads. If we keep in mind that the 10 Commandments are typical rules governing the tribe, we should be able to further develop our analysis. The tradition was to be renewed by Jesus, and Muhammad would have a similar experience in Mecca. Many books include narratives about the contact of various prophets with God. It is clear that these were traditional narrations of guiding ideas and actions during important stages of that time. This is the nature of the narrative. The holy text reflects the natural and social facts and events in the language of the time, which I call the prophetic style. We can easily say that this tradition represents a historical stage relevant to our topic. 1. It opposed histories and that period's first 2 major civilizations ruled by god kings. This was the very first rebellion of servants against God. 2. A new ideological expression was created, a discourse that said the god kings were simple human beings, but God was not human. He was the true creator of all things, and only He can be God and Rob. 3. You could only submit to Him and not to god kings. These were the main principles of the new ideology. The 3 points are the basis shared by this marvelous tradition called the Abrahamic religions. After many historical experiences, widespread sections of society gradually came to oppose the upper layer, who did not contend with monopolization and defied themselves. This meant that these large sections of the society developed a sacredness and divine discourse that were more beneficial to them. It is far more important to explain the change that occurred in relation to moral and political society. In the previous 2 millennia, moral and political society had been dealt a major blow. A very important development was the replacement of the deities of nature with the servant-god duality, expressed strictly through the domination of mythological male gods, who are the creators of the land, the sky, and the sea. This is a clear indication that the ideological aspect of moral and political society has also been dealt a major blow. A major transformation in material and immaterial culture was taking place. Mythological narratives overflow with expressions of this. It goes without saying that in this long historical period, the triad of priest, king, and commander, who are organized as a sprawling network of material interests over social nature and hidden behind an ideological mask, dealt a major blow to moral and political society. When we start from this paradigm, we can understand the society of this 2,000-year period a lot better. The crafting of a concept is very difficult and requires a great endeavor. The paradigm of the Abrahamic tradition undoubtedly reconceptualized at least 2,000-year period of the Nimrods and Pharaohs, as well as bringing about the transition to a more humane and reasonable narrative and religion. The new religious narrative was, of course, also metaphysical, and differs by far from today's rationality and social sciences. Yet it was still a very important historical development. It did not constitute a complete return to the moral and political society of the old times, as is clear from the 10 Commandments, which present morality exclusively as religion. Moses' 10 Commandments are obvious moral principles in religious garb. Elements of faith are secondary and weak. Therefore, Substituting religion for morality was a very important transformation of moral and political society. The simpler moral and political life of the past was covered with a God that pervades all. In effect, life is wrapped in the cloak of a more advanced religion. What most requires investigation is whether this religionized morality and politics was opposed to civilization or constituted a new civilization in itself. This is the historical past of the present, ongoing debate about secularism and Islamic civilization, particularly in Turkey and the Middle East. Considering the evolution of the Abrahamic religions to date, it is possible to give a dual response. The tendency that resonates with the upper layer is the stratum that seeks to create kingdoms and principalities based on maintaining the power of the Nimrods and the pharaohs under fresh ideological cover, and has done so since the religion's emergence. Abraham, for example, continued to trade while leading his tribe, which tells us a lot about his position. It is not difficult to establish that he sought a local principality or kingdom. He does not wish to remain as a simple servant of Nimrod. He found this religiously, as well as morally and politically, distasteful. It's highly likely that Moses was a dissident prince in Egypt. He rebelled against the pharaoh, representing the Hebrew community, who were poor, lived in semi-slavery, and had not fully integrated into Egypt, but had preserved a distinct character. The Holy Scripture tells us that following very difficult negotiations with the pharaoh, he decided to leave Egypt. His exodus from Egypt, with the Hebrews he has organized in complete secrecy, was successful. The story of his 40-year struggle in the desert depicts his endeavor to establish a new principality or emirate. He develops rules. He is searching for an imagined promised land. As we know, this utopia was achieved around 1000 BCE in today's Israel-Palestinian territory by the prophets Solomon, David, and Samuel. The true ideological leaders are the Samuel-like priests. After 1000 BCE, many similar principalities that evoke the example of the establishment of small nation-states and kingdoms were formed, taking advantage of the conflict between the two major blocs, the East and the West. Today, a similar, although somewhat different, trend continues to exist, particularly in South America, but also in many other countries around the world. Second was the anti-civilization tendency of the poor and radical sections of society. These sections understood that becoming civilized would aggravate their problems. Even in the first kingdom of Israel and Judah, this was an intense contradiction. This is partly reflected in the fierce opposition of the Samuel-like priests to the leaders who became kings. The emergence of Jesus would make all of this even clearer. During this period, class division had deepened among the Hebrew people. The representatives of the upper layer, the owners of the kingdom of Judah, who were Roman collaborators, accused Jesus of undermining their power and had him seized and crucified. The governor who represented Rome did not insist that Jesus be crucified. It was the representatives of the kingdom of Judah who demanded crucifixion. It is clear that Jesus was regarded as a symbol of the first great interpeople's party that represented the poor, not only of the Hebrews, but of all peoples, impoverished by the Romans and the Persians. This was a new movement developing against classical civilization. The members of this movement lived an anti-Roman and anti-Sasanian underground life for 300 years, running the risk of all types of hunger and torture. Later, the senior management of the politicized movement officially collaborated with Roman Emperor Constantine, becoming the ideological organ of the second largest Eastern Roman Empire, built during the Byzantine era. In contrast, the poor and the radical sections, linked to different denominations, displayed a fierce resistance that lasted for centuries. The resistance displayed by the Arianists, Assyrians, and Gregorians is important. Clearly, class struggle and even the struggle for a moral and political society, carried out by the oppressed tribes and peoples under religious cover, has continued unabated for centuries. The major factor in the formation of denominations within Christianity is the debate about whether Jesus was created from divine nature or human nature. Its roots go back to Sumerian mythology. The upper stratum declared itself the descendants of God, asserting at the same time that it was impossible for lower strata to be God's descendants. This discourse profoundly affected the Abrahamic religions as well. Muhammad's attitude is clear. Man is not God, but a messenger of God and can only be his servant. This is a contradictory issue within Christianity. Denominations that came out of the poor strata claimed that Jesus was of human descent, while those who were eyeing possible collaboration with the rulers tended to claim that he was God's descendant. In essence, the issue is about class formations. The anti-civilizational struggle, maintained by local and transformed official mythological beliefs, had both class and ethnic characteristics in the period from 3000 to 1500 BCE. The aspiration for freedom is clear. There are numerous examples to support this argument. The tribes and Ashirets with Aryan roots in the Tauros-Zagros area waged a mighty struggle and destroyed the Akkadian Empire in 2150 BCE, establishing the Gutian dynasty. Later, in alliance with the Hittites, who, with the Kassites, occupied Babylonia in 1596 BCE, they formed the Mitanni Confederation in 1500 BCE, with Sedekani as its center and all of the Egyptian and Mesopotamian cities acknowledging its power. The Abrahamic tradition of resistance developed after this historical phase and has been quite effective in a variety of ways within different historical formations to date. Still, it would be wrong to entirely detach the Abrahamic tradition from mythology. The majority of events taking place in all three holy books can also be found in Sumerian and Egyptian mythology. The difference is primarily related to God and the transitions underway in different periods. The important thing is that moral and political society imposed itself through strong local ideological and religious expressions. Religion is largely moral resistance. The Zoroastrian tradition in particular denotes a more radical transformation. This tradition, a very influential source for the Abrahamic religions, is the semi-philosophical and semi-religious moral and political teaching of the Zagros Mountains. The Zoroastrian questioning of the god with Semitic origins, with the famous question, "Tell me, who are you?" reflects a radical rupture. By replacing sanctity with good and evil, as well as the concepts of light and dark for the very first time, they paved the way for later Greek ethics and philosophical movements. It is possible to deduce from the Herodotus' histories, which are primarily stories about the Medians, that the Greeks owe much to Zoroastrian tradition, which they encountered through the Medians. It can be argued that the Zoroastrian tradition continued to reflect the strong moral and political society of the mountain tribes and Aryan agricultural society at large, which had not been colonized. Understandably, it expressed the moral and political reality of a society where slavery had not really developed, and there was still a substantial free social life. D. The Greco-Roman civilization of the final period of antiquity encompassed all three traditions. On both peninsulas, the period of traditional god-kings was the first phase. The Greco-Roman mythology is the last variant of the Sumerian and Egyptian originals. The mythological tradition experienced its last great era during the Etruscan and Spartan kingdoms. During the Roman Republic and the Athenian democracy, the philosophical tradition came to the forefront as the mythological narrative died out. Socrates is the famous philosopher, and Cicero the famous orator of this period. The Athenian and Roman citizens, who were not prepared to easily abandon their former free traditions, were still quite devoted to their moral and political society tradition. They struggled intensely against monarchy and imperial systems. This is reflected in the struggle between Athens and Sparta, and the struggle of the leading figures of Roman aristocracy with Caesar. Socrates and Cicero were philosophers of morals and thought, and were important figures in the development of the early doctrines of ethics and democratic politics. Although not reflected in society as a whole, it is indisputable that the power of Athens and Rome stemmed from their still vigorous moral and political society tradition. The limited institution of slavery cannot be compared to the large masses of free citizens, both in urban and rural areas, and this makes their role in the development of doctrines about the republic and democracy important. The Roman Republic and Athenian democracy succumbed to the imperial experiments of Augustus and Alexander, which was a significant setback, given that most of the positive values left by the Roman and Athenian period were the product of the republic and democracy. For the first time in recorded history, we confront the fact that moral and political societies express themselves better, although not fully, with the republic and democracy. To fully express themselves, moral and political societies must move beyond representative democracy. They need direct, participatory democracy. Christianity, the third tradition, initially had a destructive role within the empire. Christianity and the offensive by the Germanic tribes were strong constituents of the democratic civilization before the collapse of the Roman Empire. With the rise of the Byzantine Empire, Christianity fell into the reactionary position of being a representative of the statist and official civilization. However, the representation of very strong oppositional denominations shows that Christianity continues to play a positive role in the development of democratic civilization. As a result, the classical civilization system increasingly developed its hegemonic character based on the 3,500-year-old city, class, and state triad. However, despite this, it collapsed under the assault of anti-civilizational Christianity and anti-civilizational tribal resistances and defensives, showing us very clearly the course of historical development. The degeneration of the upper layers and reproduction of classical civilization that occurs at the heart of democratic civilization forces does not change this fact. Let's not forget that classical civilization's territory and cities are still like islands in the sea of democratic forces. Humanity had not abandoned moral and political society. Thousands of years of war reflected this. It was, in fact, the tendency toward freedom in the form of moral and political society that was trying to sustain itself in a religious disguise. It is very important that we understand this. E. The main problem in relation to Islam, the last major Abrahamic religion, is whether it is a continuation of classical civilization or a strong voice for democratic civilization. I do not believe this debate is over. Mecca, the city the Prophet Muhammad emerged from, was a trading city. It had a vast hinterland in its own way. It was located at the intersection of north-south and east-west trade routes. It was also a central market where Arab tribes met to trade. Ideas, god symbols, and slaves were available alongside commercial goods. This was the place where religions from Abrahamic tradition, as well as mythological and even the animist tradition, all resonated. Hajj is the center of pilgrimage. When the Prophet Muhammad was born, the Byzantine Empire, one of two empires going through a transition from antiquity to the Middle Ages, reached Damascus in the north and carried with it the official branch of Christianity it controlled. Assyrian priests were mostly in the opposition and accelerated the Christianization of the Sasanians. The Sasanians, on the other hand, sought to expand their hegemony from the northeast to the Arabian Peninsula. In the southwest, the effect of Christian Abyssinia spread into Yemen. The Jews, who represent the oldest part of the Abrahamic tradition, permeated the peninsula, benefiting from a wealth of property and trade. The Arab tribes, the true original inhabitants of the peninsula, on the other hand, were in a deep socio-economic crisis. The former frequent expeditions in all four directions were no longer possible because of the strength of the existing civilizations. Prior to the Sumerian and Egyptian civilizations, Semitic tribes attacked the fertile Neolithic areas and the later city civilizations. Amorite, Apuru, Akkad, Canaan, and Aramaic are names that were given to them in different periods. It was a period when the tribes were under extreme pressure and approaching the point of implosion. You might say that the Arabs were waiting for a miracle to realize their last major expansion. Islam was that miracle. It is clear that Muhammad understood his time and the conditions well. He embodied all of the characteristics needed for a new period of history. He did not become a disciple of any of the existing ideological traditions. He was influenced by Judaism and Christianity, as well as by Zoroastrianism and Sabianism. His attitude toward idols was similar to Abraham's. He understood that they would not serve his goals. His initial propaganda and military action were against the Mecca trade monopoly. He knew that if he did not break their influence, he could not benefit from tribal dynamism. His reinterpretations of the revelations about God were very similar to the tradition of the Ten Commandments. It is clear that he was trying to inculcate the tribes with a new moral and political perspective. If the essence of the concept of Allah can be analyzed on the basis of his 99 names, then it becomes clear what kind of social utopia is being constructed. In Medina, where he held political power, he further clarified his utopia. The success of his initial actions was seen as miraculous, which increased his self-confidence. The way that Muhammad worked in Medina was fairly important to our discussion. The mosque functioned as a democratic assembly. Initially, meetings to address social problems were held in the mosque, and until Muhammad's death, the mosque continued to play this role. The rituals of worship were part of educational activities aimed at strengthening the believer's personality. Nobody can deny that this was the nature of emergent Islam. Although under complete religious cover, clearly, a powerfully dynamic, moral and political society was revived. Therefore, if we are to talk about a true Mohammedan movement and Islam, then we must say that it is an undeniable fact that a moral and political society can only be rebuilt on the basis of participatory democracy, and with the goal of overcoming fundamental problems. It is known that some actions were extreme, and that Muhammad proceeded very hesitantly as a result, especially around the issue of Qibla, as well as of the killing of all the men of the Jewish Qurayza tribe because of their collaboration with the Quraysh aristocracy. Had a suitable solution been found, perhaps the Arab-Hebrew contradiction could have been resolved at the time, and Islam would have progressed even further. On the whole, Islam can be described as a movement that is close to being democratic, libertarian, and egalitarian. Its expansion in a very short time cannot be seen as the result of use of arms alone. Islam's misfortune was to become a tool of civilizational forces much more quickly than was the case for Judaism and Christianity. Less than 50 years after its birth, it was used like a patch to the classical civilization forces in the hands of the Muawiyah dynasty in Damascus. The massacre of al-Bayt was also the destruction of many Islam's positive features. I would argue that it was the end of Islam. Denominations that were shaped by the followers of al-Bayt and Khawarij, the Islam of the poor, are noteworthy traditions. The Shia branch of al-Bayt joined official civilization with the Safavid dynasty in Iran, losing its anti-civilizational essence. The Alevis of Anatolia and Kurdistan, on the other hand, were ruthlessly oppressed by the Sunni tradition of power for hundreds of years, and were only able to carry on their existence as a moral and political society, and as a result, they failed to achieve systematic development. The situation was no different for the other branches. Khawarij, Karmatians, and many other similar movements tried to develop Islam as a firm class movement of the oppressed, and they were eliminated with even greater ferocity because of this. The existence of such a rich legacy under Islamic cover requires examination. This is why there is a need for a democratic history. Muhammad's Islam was never to be. Islam during the Umayyad, Abbasid, Seljuki, Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal periods cannot be called the Islam of Muhammad. This is why so many sects and denominations arose. However, there was no serious success. What is presented as Islam's success is the massive growth of a crafty trade monopoly in Mecca under Muawiyah and the related far-reaching expansion of the trade and power monopolies controlled by tribal aristocrats made possible by Mecca trade monopoly. This was clearly a betrayal of Islam. We know that the prophet Moses and the prophet Jesus were also betrayed, but the betrayal of Muhammad was a lot more comprehensive. England instrumentalized 19th and 20th century Islam as a part of its colonial expansion in the Middle East, and it was made to play an extremely reactionary, nationalist role in a variety of nation-state formations. Currently, along with the ambiguous radicalism of the Al-Qaeda variety, we have the efforts by formations like the Organization of Islamic Cooperation that have no clear presence to establish Islam's place in the world, which indicates that Islam is one of the least meaningful periods in its history. I take the Prophet Muhammad and his Islam seriously, but only if the debate unfolds around his approach to ideas, morality, and politics in particular, and provided that all those involved are prepared to respect and honor the Mohammedan reality that will emerge from any honest discussion. I will expand upon this later in this book, when it is relevant. The reader must understand why I analyze the Middle Ages from the perspective of Islam and Muhammad. Because the Middle Ages is the age of Islam, or the age of Mohammedans, but in terms of betrayal to Islam's name and essence, not in terms of its actual implementation. The precursor to our present-day hegemonic system, called capitalism, is ultimately this Islam. This is the age when trade monopolies reached their initial zenith. The center of civilization was still in the Middle East, and this was the prelude period when all the games of capitalism were first invented and implemented. The Venetian merchants, in collaboration with these monopolies, carried the material culture of the Middle East into Europe over 300 years, following the footsteps of Christianity, which had already introduced the immaterial culture of the Middle East to all of Europe between the 6th and 10th centuries. The 8th to 12th centuries, also called the Islamic Renaissance, were nothing substantial when compared to the thousands of years of civilizational tradition that preceded them. I believe that the current state of the Middle East, which is plagued with problems and has been in steady decline since the 12th century, is closely linked to this betrayal in the name of Islam. Even when the starting point offers a golden opportunity, betrayal will only do the worst. What happened to Islam confirms this. I can't stress enough my certainty that if the followers of Muhammad had developed genuine theological, ethical, philosophical, artistic, and political debates, as well as the case with the followers of Moses and Jesus, and shared the results with moral and political society, then the hegemonic center of classical civilization would not have shifted to the West. More importantly, rather than classical civilization, democratic civilization would have been the predominant development. The Judaic and Christian traditions, which withdrew from the Middle East to Europe, were a lot more open to discussion. No doubt, though, dogmatism, which is the essence of any religious tradition, continued to pose a serious obstacle. But by spreading the far from insignificant immaterial culture values of the Middle East to Europe, as dialectics would suggest, they accelerated the development of philosophy and science. What has never been done, and is still not permitted in the Islam of the Middle East, is to have just such a dialectical discussion, and to respect its conclusions. This aside, the Middle East led Europe both in agricultural and commercial development for thousands of years, and did not lag behind in manufacturing. In short, the Mohammedan movement could have shown a way forward that would have suited the history of the Middle East. But rather, crippled tribal asabiya, as Ibn Khaldun argued at the time, had already imposed something similar to the present-day nationalist fascist tendencies in the early days of Islam and wasted the Middle Ages. The central civilization system that went into decline in the Middle East resumed its ascent in Europe from the 15th century onward. the accumulation of material and immaterial culture that formed during the 10,000 years following the agricultural revolution was to make its new offensive at this point, in this new location. My intention is not to sketch the history of democratic civilization, but to attempt to define it, determine its location, and describe its historical function. I believe that history unquestionably needs this analysis. Otherwise, we would not find meaning in the so-called miraculous developments. How can we understand history without analyzing the resistance movements, wars, and communal structures that developed in opposition to those who tried to loot the material and immaterial values? We speak here of the upper layers that declared themselves gods for thousands of years in a very rich cultural atmosphere, while driving these people to extinction and imposing disreputable social structures like slavery, serfdom, cheap labor, and housewifery on them. How can we become familiar with our humanity if we don't understand history? If we respect what is socially indispensable, including politics, which is the art of reason, morality, and freedom, then we must ask and answer these questions. We will not arrive at a solution using narrow class tricks and tribal asabia. In the absence of systematizing the tremendous movements in social nature's history and revealing how and why they emerged, as well as their consequences, we can't define our existence as humans. If that were the case, our life would be meaningless. The narratives of civilization, supported by mass of propaganda, the essence of which is the networks that secure the monopoly of capital and power, do not constitute a meaningful history of humanity. Democratic civilization's initiative to build a historical society arises from the need to end the capitalist network's deceit, not only because we can imagine new worlds, but because they are absolutely indispensable. Before it was possible to completely shatter the medieval dogmatism that destroyed the human being, the much worse dogmatism of the nation-state infiltrated people's minds. It is 1,000 times worse than the chauvinism of the tribal asabia. This, along with the establishment of national histories that blind people and lead them to disregard the facts, has created new deserts of the intellect. Blood has flowed like a river to create and validate this disgusting history. Nationalism and the nation-state are nothing more than the most reactionary idol running over the whole of humanity. I am making an attempt to formulate the history, knowing that even the so-called darkest ages of social consciousness were not this barren and humanity had not yet fallen so far. I must repeat, without knowing social nature's history, we can never understand the reality. I will never forgive myself for evaluating history so bleakly for so long, under the sway of capitalism. Without knowing history, which is a true apocalypse of humanity, and thus not being bound to the reality of moral and political society, we cannot avoid falling into the most disrespectful and unworthy of positions. The more historical you are, the more you can understand the reality. History, on the other hand, can only establish a link with social reality if it is the history of democratic civilization. Because of its importance, I will present my approach to the history of the democratic civilization as opposed to capitalist modernity under a separate heading in the next section.